And we're particularly delighted to have Sir Geoffrey Palmer with us, and I know we're all waiting with bated breath to hear his lecture this evening. My name's Nicola Fisher. I'm convener of the Equalities Committee for the EIS, and it's my great pleasure to both welcome you here this evening and also to introduce our guests. Now, can I just ask that we do have a microphone up here which is linked to this enormous speaker. Can you hear me okay, or do you, if you wanted to, I'm happy to use the microphone, but I thought probably we would be all right. We're all right. Excellent. That's good. That was the right answer. Thank you. So before I just begin the introduction, if I could just say if anyone is tweeting this evening, please could you tag the EIS in. It's just at EIS Union, and our comms department will pick that up. And there are also two hashtags for this evening. One you'll have to remember your letters for, so it's hashtag EISBMH, and I'm sure we can figure out what those stand for. But also, it's very important that you include the hashtag Sir Geoffrey Palmer, because that will be picked up worldwide apparently. So please try, if you are tweeting, you can include those. That would be really lovely. In common with a number of other UK cities, Edinburgh unfortunately has many historical links with the slave trade. Prominent Edinburgh citizens made their money from slavery, and rum, sugar, rice, mahogany and tobacco arrived in Edinburgh from slave plantations. This last was the basis of the fortune amassed by James Gillespie, for example, who of course founded a school in his name. Edinburgh is not alone in this, of course, and Glasgow, where I live and work, also had very strong links to the slave trade, especially with the infamous tobacco lords, and many links to the colonies where slavery was rife. The evidence is there in our buildings and our street names: Buchanan Street, Glassford Street, Spears Wharf and the Mitchell Library. Glasgow University, as many of you will know, recently agreed to pay £20 million in reparations for the money that they had in the 18th and 19th centuries from the slave traders, which in today's money would have been anything between 16.7 million and 198 million. I almost wondered if they'd missed out the decimal point from that. It seems such a vast sum. So they have recently agreed to pay £20 million in reparations going to the University of the West Indies to fund a joint centre for development research. And that was announced in August of this year. In Edinburgh, of course, here in the Georgian New Town, many of the grand citizens who would have lived here had made their money from the slave trade, and Morey Place and the buildings that we are in this evening are very much part of that. And that's one of the reasons that we have decided to hold this lecture this evening and to ask Sir Geoffrey Palmer to come along and talk to us. Geoff is Professor Emeritus in the School of Life Sciences at Heriot-Watt University. Originally born in St Elizabeth in Jamaica before living in Kingston, and then he moved to join his mother, who was part of the Windrush generation in London in 1955. Geoff established himself as a leading expert in cereal crops, and I know that tonight some of you were talking to him about that part of his career and his life, pioneering methods to speed up the transformation of grain into malt. And some grateful recipients of Geoff's expertise are not just the drinkers of those beverages, but companies such as Brewdog and Stewart Brewing here in Edinburgh. Geoff worked at the Brewing Research Foundation in Surrey before returning to Heriot-Watt in 1977 and became Scotland's first black professor in 1989. He led the way in Scotland's two most important sectors, education and whisky, by securing the International Centre for Brewing and Distilling at Heriot-Watt University in 1989. He was awarded the OBE for his contributions to grain science in 2003. Of course, that is not the only string to our speaker's bow. Professor Palmer has done a vast amount of work for race equality in education as early as 1969, writing articles and calling for policy change to support the improvement of education for children from ethnic minorities. His celebrated race relations fable, Mr. White and the Ravens, was published in 2001. Professor Palmer authored a major work on the connection between Scotland's wealth and its involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, The Enlightenment Abolished, which was published in 2007. In the same year, which was the bicentenary of the Slave Trade Act, he was named as one of 100 Great Black Britons. Geoff has been involved in the Edinburgh and Lothians Regional Equality Council since 1978 and now serves as its honorary president. He is currently the Treasurer of the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on the Caribbean and has been recognised by MSPs as having devoted his life to achieving breakthroughs in the fight against racism. In 2014, Professor Palmer was knighted for his services to human rights, science and charity. Colleagues, we consider ourselves very honoured to have Professor Palmer here to address us tonight, and if I could ask you to give him a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know, I'm not good with this technology.
Just put it up there.
There, Yes.
Is that high enough, Ali?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is that, can you hear me at the back? That's good. Thank you very much. I hope you don't mind me taking off my jacket. As you know, I live in Pennycook, and it's a bit warm down here for me. So I always take my jacket off when I come down to Edinburgh. But thank you very much. And what I will do, I've got the technology here. I'll see if it works. Right. I don't know. Maybe the light. Can you see the slide well? Okay. What I'm going to do within the time period is to just go through a bit of this history, which you've got a great summary of, because whenever I was in a taxi this morning and the taxi driver was saying, "Where are you going?" and I said, "I'm going to the BBC radio in Edinburgh," and he said, "Why?" and I said, "Because I'm going to talk about slavery," and he said, "Slavery in Scotland?" He said, "We don't have any slaves." And I said, "For example, do you know anything about the big statue in the middle of St. Andrew's Square?" And he said, "No, it's very tall. What's it got to do with slavery?" And I said, "Well, he actually gradually abolished the slave trade for 15 years, which caused 630,000 people to be transported into slavery for economic reasons." And the taxi driver was just absolutely astonished that a statue of, relating to that could be in the middle of the city. So we have a history which is not well known by a lot of people, and the general statement which is made from one end of Scotland to the other, "Why hasn't anybody told us this before?" And if you read the Sunday Times, last Sunday Times, you will see why, because I'm having a spat with a historian, Michael Fry, over the slave trade and its meaning, and his view in the Sunday Times this week was all this discussion, he said, about Dundas and prolonging the slave trade. He said it's just the actions of what he calls today's politically correct. And that's one of our major historians who has written about slavery, and that's his view. I, of course, just gave one word response to that, which was published in the Sunday Times. It wasn't that. I just said humbug. Now, what I'm going to do is to start off with how some people justified that slavery. And there was a very famous case in Edinburgh in 1774, and it's called the Joseph Knight case. And there's a novel called Joseph Knight, but it's actually a legal case in Edinburgh, which it started in Perth, but finished in Edinburgh. So it started in the Perth Sheriff Court, and it eventually ended up in the Court of Sessions in Edinburgh between 1774 and 1778. And this is one of the documents relating to that case. And it's in Register House. I went and photocopied it. And what I'm going to show you is some of the debate in that case, because it was about a black young man in Scotland who ran away from his owner, which was John Weatherburn, and John Weatherburn wanted him back. And the documents relating to that case, I say, is in Register House, and I'm going to show you a statement from it. And what this statement from one of the documents says, Europeans, particularly the nations of the northern parts, such as Britain, are perfectly incapable of labour in the climates where sugar is produced. A Negro, if not overworked, can toil under the influence of a West Indian sun without impairing his health or shortening his life, whereas a native of this country cannot support labour in the same proportion for a month without certain destruction. Now that's a court document, and this is one of the lawyers actually putting it to the judge why slavery in the Caribbean was justified. And as I said, this was written in Edinburgh, not in the United States or the West Indies. And what we have in the same documents, it also stated that really Negroes are framed for the slave climate. So it's what, when I was at university, I used to write my essays, and my lecturer, she used to write in it teleology. And I never quite knew what it meant. But what it meant was, the philosophy then in the 1700s was that black people were designed for slavery. And the philosopher Kant, who invented the concept of race, actually was one of the people who put that forward by saying black people are not quite human. And in Edinburgh we have Hume saying exactly the same. And we have Mombodo saying exactly the same in Scotland. So what you had was a philosophical justification for enslaving black people. It wasn't chance. And what we have here is a little one of the panels from the Scottish tapestry, diaspora tapestry. And there were two left to be stitched. One was on Mary Seacole, and that one needed to be stitched. So that's hand stitched, and I stitched it. And I sat there when I used to go home from work, and I'm stitching away, and my wife says, "What are you doing? You don't even stitch your own clothes or socks." However, it was drawn by an artist, and I stitched just follow the artist's design. And what we have is depicting that the black slave has got sugar cane on his shoulder, and on the sugar cane you have Moneymusk, Glasgow, Fort William, Dumbarton, Hermitage, Dundee, Hampden, Argyll, etc., Montrose. And on the body of the slave you have Cunningham, Wetherburn, Oswald, Ewing, Gladstone, Bailey, etc. Those are slave owners. The name on his body and on the cane, it's obviously Scottish place names. And of course I will talk about some of the names. For example, Cunningham, the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow. Well, that was his house. So, and Gladstone, the Gladstone family were involved in slavery. So again, and I'll talk about them and the Ewings. The necropolis was built by James Ewing, and his slave plantation was in Jamaica. In fact, the family still owns the plantation they owned during slavery, the Ewing Hamiltons. What we have, if we look at British slavery and abolition, it started off, say, about 1562 with John Hawkins buying and just selling slaves. But once the English, I would say, started to have colonies in the Caribbean, then, in fact, British slavery started. Because once the English had, for example, Jamaica or Barbados, Jamaica was taken by the English from the Spanish in 1655. And of course, British slavery, therefore, in Jamaica started in 1655. But if we look through some of the significant changes with slavery, for example, 1661, we have the British Barbados Slave Code. And if you look at it, type it in on your phone, British Barbados Slave Code, it'll come up and it says, a slave has no right to life and is really property. Now, that is the reason why in 1833-34, when the slaves were emancipated, just before abolition in 1838, the slave owners were compensated because the slaves were property. So the Barbados Slave Code said they were property, and when slavery was over, in terms of the slaves were emancipated, people like John Gladstone actually said, well, we've got to be compensated for our property. And they were given 200 million in 1833, which is billions today. In fact, John Gladstone, that's the father of William Gladstone, the Prime Minister. John Gladstone was born in Leith. In fact, his father is buried in Coburg Street. John Gladstone, his father, left Leith, went to Liverpool, made a fortune, came back, became an MP, bought a family house in Fask, in Feta Cairn. And in 1833, he received, for 2,508 slaves, 2,508, he received 83 million in today's money. Come on in. He received 83 million in today's money for his 2,508 slaves. So we have that history. It's in walking distance from here because, as I say, John Gladstone was born in Leith. We have, slavery wasn't just about black people, white people, slaves, non-slaves. It was a business. So therefore, it provided opportunities for a lot of Scottish young men who, there were no job opportunities here. So they went to the Caribbean. And for example, you'll see, if you look at the Union, there are 25 articles to the Union. Article 4, and nobody's had a look at it. I had a good look at the articles because I felt the articles must have something to do with it. And I looked at the article a few years ago, and I looked at Article 4. And Article 4 says, once you sign this, you will then can increase your trade with England and with the plantations in the Dominions. So again, the Scots were given that as a bribe for signing the Union. Just in passing, Article 13, you know, I'm involved with a bit of that as well, even though I wasn't 200 years ago. Article 13 deals with alcohol, with the malt tax, which is my expertise. I'm the country's malt expert. The irony is, Article 13 was the last of the 25 articles to be signed. It wasn't signed until 1725. There were riots in Glasgow because the Scots realised the increase in malt tax would affect the whiskey and the beer industries. Okay, that's just a little aside. But you can see the trades. You had military, church ministers, doctors, builders, surveyors, shopkeepers. You had import of cotton, linen, etc. So slavery was a business. It wasn't just about enslavement. And if we look at some of that evidence for that, you have, this is a former head office of the British Linen Bank. And in 1750s, 60s, this was the headquarters of the British Linen Bank. And linen was actually made in Scotland, and the linen were used as clothes for the slaves. So there's a small town near St. Andrew called Osnaburg, which I visited, and they made, in fact, linen for the clothes for the slaves. And it was one of the most significant business in Scotland at that time. 1746, in terms of, making linen to clothe the slaves. And the building is still there in St. Andrew's Square. What we had surveyors. That's James Robinson from Shetland. He surveyed Jamaica, and he got himself £600,000 for doing a survey map at that time, because nobody knew where the land was in Jamaica. So it was extremely important that he surveyed the island properly. The black areas are sugarcane plantations, and the hatched areas are coffee plantations. So Jamaica was just absolutely solid with slaves. In fact, the British had 800,000 slaves by 1800. 800,000 slaves in the West Indies. 300,000 were in Jamaica. The island is 150 miles long and about 50 miles wide at its widest. And Jamaica had 300,000 slaves. And if you look at Scottish history in the 1700s, you can't turn many pages without finding something about Jamaica. In fact, Jamaica Street in Glasgow was built in 1763, a long time ago. I don't know when the Jamaica Street in Edinburgh was built, but the Glasgow one is very significant in terms of commerce in Scotland. And of course, these are the family names that played significant part in slavery. And a lot of those family names, you recognize them today, such as the Baileys are still in Inverness. They have a large mansion there. I went and visited the other day. The Bailey family. The Balcarras, Lord Balcarras. When he was governor of Jamaica, was made governor by Enra Dundas. The Weatherburn brothers. We'll speak about them later. You've got Dundas, the Grants, the Gladstone, you've got Blackburn, Danzel, and you go to the Moyers, the Wars, Boswell and Johnson, Glassford Street, Denniston in Glasgow, Buchanan Street, Cunningham, Oswald Street, Oaken Crew, Malcolm, MacDonald, Ewing, Spears, Bogle, etc. All those names are significant in slavery and at the present time the Scottish aristocracy. And you'll find that a lot of those families are married to each other. So the Spears are married to the Buchanans, etc. And of course, when I started to look at this in 2007, that was the 200th year, the commemoration of the abolition of the slave trade. I wanted to try and show this Jamaica link, which was difficult because historians had not dealt with it. And lateral thinking, as I do when I'm doing my barley malt research, I rang up my cousin in Jamaica and said, send me a Jamaica telephone directory. And he sent it. I didn't know what was in it because we didn't have a telephone when I was in Jamaica. And when it arrived, I opened it up, and 70% of the names in that telephone directory are Scottish surnames. There are 2,500 Campbells in that telephone directory. There are only 1,500 in Edinburgh and the Lothians. Then I looked at my family. My mother is Larmond. It never occurred to me, it had any link. My mother is Larmond, and my cousins, I've got a Gladstone Wood in the family, I've got a Mowat, and they're Walkers, etc. in my family. In fact, I was so fascinated by this, I got in my car and I drove to Argyll, because that's where the Larmonds come from. And I drove right to the bottom of Argyll, and there was this one house, and this knocked on the door and the couple came out, and I said, do you know where the Larmonds come from? And I thought something had happened. The world had ended because they'd never seen a black guy before. And we then sat and had a long chat. And I drove back to Pennycook. And I'm sure they were telling their neighbours and friends, do you know there was a black guy down here? And they've obviously put them in an institution because it can't be true. But I had a good time. This is it, trying to develop what I call a sense of belonging. that once I realised the link between Larmond and Scotland, then I had that drive to try and see how that link fit in with this history. Now, I said about doctors, here's an example. And, that's President of the Royal College of Physicians, that's Queen Street, that's just down the road. And this gentleman, Mr. Wright, left Perthshire, went to Edinburgh for his degree, went to Jamaica, worked on the Hampden estate, which is owned by the Stirlings of Kerr. And he himself became a slave owner, anti-abolitionist, self-interest, and became Surgeon General of Jamaica. And then he became President of the Royal College of Physicians in Queen Street in 1801 to 1803. And that's Kerr House with the Stirlings of Kerr. And they, of course, own the Hampden plantation in Jamaica. That's Oaken House. And Oaken House, I found out about it, got in my car, drove over there, had a look. I said to the guy, could you let me in? He said no. And then we sat and had a long chat and said, well, as my ancestors paid for that. Which then confused him. He couldn't figure out how that came about if I came on Windrush. Oaken House was owned by Richard Oswald, and his wife, Mary Ramsay. I've just been up north in near Stonehaven, and the Ramsays are from that area. So Richard Oswald met Mary Ramsay in Jamaica, and the grants of Moneymusk of Speyside introduced them. This is in the 1700s, 1767. So Oswald was introduced to Mary Ramsay. They came back, got married, and of course Richard Oswald became a really wealthy slave owner. He worked with the grants of Speyside, and they owned Barnes Island in Sierra Leone, and they bought and sold slaves from Barnes Island like it were a supermarket. And so families became very wealthy. Oswald bought Oaken House. That's his wife. And of course, there are all the links, because one of Burns's most vitriolic poem is Ode Sacred to the Memory of Mrs. Oswald of Oakencrove. It's Mary Ramsay, Richard Oswald's wife. And apparently he was turfed out of his lodgings. It's about 1789. And he went away and wrote this poem about her. And in that poem, and I'll just mention it at the end, but I'll mention it now in context. Burns's poem, he says two things in that poem which are significant in terms of slavery, because he knew about slavery, he knew the people who were in it. And he said in that poem, he said she was on 10,000 glittering pounds per year, 1789. That's about 10 million. That was her annuity from her husband, Richard. But he also said, probably the most powerful line of avarice probably ever written, he said she had hands that took but never gave. And that's in the poem. So again, we have a poem written by Burns which people have not associated it with that building, which is still there. It's absolutely magnificent inside. And that is a story of what this slavery was about. That's his son inherited it, and that's his son's wife. And again, if we that's on the west. If we come back just up the road in walking distance again, that's Rodney Street, and that's Eyre Place. Now, Eyre was governor of Jamaica in 1865, and Rodney, it's one of the most significant names in British naval history, probably more important than Trafalgar. Because in 1782, the French decided they were going to take Jamaica, because Jamaica was providing over 50% of the income of the slave empire. So Jamaica was the most valuable piece of land, you know, in the empire. And the French decided they were going to take it in 1782. And of course, Britain was then just about losing America. It was 1783, you know, the American final independence. So 1782, had the French taken Jamaica, we don't know what would have happened with the world. Had they taken Jamaica, they'd have all that money. They'd have probably gone back and take America. So they had to be defeated in 1782. It wasn't a war that, if we didn't win Trafalgar, probably wouldn't have made a lot of difference. The point is that Rodney and Hood are the two admirals who were sent down to Jamaica. And they couldn't lose, they had to win. And they went down to Jamaica on the 12th of April, 1782. And I think they, within that battle, they killed 3,000 Frenchmen, killed and wounded, to save Jamaica. And that's why you have Rodney Streets all over the country. In fact, there's a Rodney Street in Liverpool where Gladstone was born. William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, was born in Rodney Street in Liverpool. And we have a Rodney Street just up the road, and that's why we have it. It is defending slaves in Jamaica. It's defending our income from slavery. Why we have Rodney Street. That's the Gallery of Modern Art. That's William Cunningham's house in Glasgow. Even by today's standard, it's outrageous. You know, that was his house in 1778. And again, I spoke about Gladstone. That's William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, 4 times. It's got a nice statue in the middle of, I think it's George Square. Yeah, it's got a statue there. That's his father, John Gladstone, who got 83 millions for his slave. And that's the family house in Fask. I actually drove up to have a look at it. That's the Gladstone's house in Fask in Fairtacare. And all the surrounding land is owned by the Gladstone family. That's again in Glasgow. That's Glasford Street, the present Glasford Street. But it used to have a big house there called Schofield Mansion. And that was built by Campbell. And of course, he got himself into some trouble because he was the one who supported the passing of the malt tax in 1725. And of course, the people in Glasgow were so incensed, they actually burnt down some of his property, and he was compensated. And he used that compensation money to buy Isla. That's why the Campbells own Isla. And of course, the house, that's disappeared. And this house, Schofield Mansion, eventually was owned by John Glasford, who was a tobacco lord. And of course, we don't have Schofield Mansion anymore, but we have Glasford Street, where the Trades Hall is at the moment. And I've got little things to do with the Trades Hall, in that I'm a member of the maltman trade in the Trades Hall. And I remember I had a meeting there a couple of years ago, and it was late and I couldn't get back to Edinburgh. So I went down to the Gobles to stay in the Premier Inn. And when I got there, this lovely Glaswegian lady sitting in the kiosk, and there's only the two of us, 2 o'clock in the morning. And I said, can I stay the night? And she said, yep. And I said, how much it is? And she said, £63. So I looked across the hall and I could see a cutout of Lenny Henry. And I said, well, why is he paying 29? So very Glaswegian-like, she looks me up and down. And it's just the two of us. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. And she's looking me up and down and she said, are you Lenny Henry then? I thought she got me. So I gave her the £63 And I went to my bed, and I got up in the morning, and I'm passing the kiosk, and she has her pal with her. And I could hear them bantering away in the kiosk. And just before I left the door, I heard her friend saying to her, "That's not Lenny Henry. That's Trevor MacDonald." In Glasgow, they have a different perspective of this history. But again, we're back to the history because we're talking about MacDonald. Again, a Scottish a surname. And of course, that's the Merchant's House in Glasgow, just next to Queen Street station. And in the Merchant's House, I'm a member of the Trades Hall, so I go to the Merchant's House sometimes for dinner. And they have two statues when you go into the Merchant's House. And not a lot of people are aware who they are. And one is James Buchanan, whose family gave the name to Buchanan Street, and he had slaves in Jamaica, and he gave the Trades Hall £10,000, and his will still is an operation today, and his money from his will still supports institutions in Glasgow. James Buchanan. And James Ewing, as I said, his family built an Acropolis, the graveyard, big graveyard in Glasgow, and the family slave plantation, the Caymanas estate in Jamaica, where my mother is buried, not far away from there. The family, Ewing Hamilton, still owns it. You know. We have other legacies from this slavery. So, Dollar Academy was built by money from the slave owner, John McNabb, and we also have Bathgate Academy, which was built by John Newland, and he was in Jamaica. They're both links with slavery. In fact, Dollar Academy now is trying to emulate Glasgow in terms of looking at their history, in terms of what sort of reparative justice they could enact, in terms of following Glasgow's first light. What you have as well, when the slave owners were in Jamaica, they had children. And a lot of Jamaicans or West Indians are descended not just from African ancestors, but from Scottish ones too. In fact, I've just done my DNA, and my wife brought it up, and she's Aberdeen. She has an Aberdeen sense of humour, which is not much. So she brought up my DNA results, and I'm lying down on the city having a rest after a hard week lecturing about slavery. And she said, "Do you want me to read the results?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "You're 80% Nigerian, 5% Cameroon, 5% Kenyan," and it went on till 95%. And I said, "Well, 95, she said, "Do you want to hear the rest?" I said, yeah. Well, she said, "You're about 3 to 5% Viking from Shetland." And then she walked away and said, "It explains a lot." So again, my genetics reflect this history. And there's nothing I can do about it. Not anybody can do about it. And therefore, this history now, because we know a lot more about it, that I was talking to students at Strathclyde last Friday, and young black advocates in the Bank of Scotland head office in St Andrews Square, and I said, you know, you don't need to feel any sense of isolation here, because you belong here. This is your part of your country, because you share the genes, you share the buildings, you share the history, which cannot be changed. So we cannot change the past, but we can change the consequences. And this is why, in fact, people have taken an interest in this history, because somehow they did not know they were part of a history that has changed the world. It is not just a history. Without slavery, the world would be significantly different. You wouldn't have jazz anyway. Not pop music. Can you imagine the world without pop music? It is universal. In fact, somebody was saying, we were talking about it, and one Scottish politician, and there was a lovely elderly lady sitting beside me at one of the lectures, and we were saying that, you know, most of the people, especially in the Western world, are related in terms of, you know, people falling in love. I said, you know, 70% of people in the Western world probably fall in love with pop music playing in the background, and she said it's probably more than that. So again, we have part of our culture which we take for granted is related to that slavery. And this young man, I think it's Robert Weatherburn, his father is James Weatherburn. And who are the Weatherburns? In 1746, two brothers, James and John, left Scotland for Jamaica. Their father was taken to London and hanged because he was Catholic after the war. So those two boys went to Jamaica, 1746. They came back to Scotland. And James Weatherburn, you probably know it, you know of Inverest Lodge, just outside Musselburgh. There's a house there. That's James Weatherburn's house. So he came back from Jamaica and he bought Inverest Lodge. It's now owned by the Natural Trust, I think. But that's James Weatherburn's house. And when he came back, he did like what a lot of the slave owners did. He married Lord Colville's daughter. And then he married his daughter to Lord Selkirk, of Selkirk Grace. So the slave owners, when they came back with that money, almost bought themselves into the aristocracy. And that is a young man who arrived at Inverest Lodge when James Weatherburn was there. Can you imagine him there with his family friends and his Lord Colville's daughter as his wife, and his brother John married Lord Airlie's daughter when he came back, and married his daughter to Lord Hope. So the Hope, the Airlies, the Selkirks are related through this slavery. And of course, you can imagine them sitting at Inverest Lodge one Sunday. There's a knock on the door. James Weatherburn goes out. He opens the door, and there's a black guy standing at the door in Inverest. And the black guy says to James Weatherburn, "Hello, Daddy." Lady Colville's not amused. Neither is Lady Hope. That's the young man who was standing there. He was the son of James Weatherburn. And he went to London, and he is the ancestor of one of our most significant Labour politicians, Lord Bill Weatherburn, who wrote some of our employment laws for Michael Foot. So here we have a link between this young man. He was at the Peterloo massacre protesting for white workers in 1819. And he is the ancestor of Lord Bill Weatherburn, who I knew well. And so we have that link, which is more than just history. It is family. And I said families, of course, as I said, you know, the slave owners marry women who, in fact, were either the daughters of slave owners or the widows, the widows of, and of course, these guys married them for their money, you know, keeping it in the family. The taxi driver I was speaking to this morning, I said, you know, Melville Castle, he thought it was a tell. I said, that's Henry Dundas's house. He was Viscount Melville. And he married a young girl, that was her property, Rennie. And when he divorced her, in those days, the men kept the property of the women. So Melville Castle Hotel was owned by his wife. And he actually took it off her in terms of the way the system worked then. So a lot of slave owners marry women who were associated with slavery, but who were also wealthy. Of course, we had Glasgow mentioned earlier, and of course I was advising Glasgow when they decide to look at their history to see what their links were with slavery, if any. And of course, one of the things they unearthed was this gentleman. He, in fact, was one of their rectors, Robert Cunningham Graham of Gartmore. And they didn't know who he was. He even set up an essay prize in the university. Many, you're talking about 1790s. He was rector of Glasgow University, and they weren't aware of that. He's notorious for having exchanged a slave for a good bottle of wine. So you have this sort of link, but it's interesting that you notice the painting is by Rayburn. So Richard Oswald's wife was Rayburn, and a lot of slave owners got themselves painted by well-known or great painters when they came back, because they knew it would last. It wouldn't be destroyed, so almost they're leaving a legacy of themselves through these paintings. Dundas, I'll just mention him. He was, as I say, we were discussing him in the Sunday Times last Sunday, because we're looking at a plaque, looking at his plaque, how we can change it to make it more truthful. And of course we're stuck because there's a debate. There's Michael Fry, the historian, myself. In fact, the present Viscount is on the committee, which I thought was a bit of conflict of interest there. However, he's on the committee, and he obviously, I think, looking at him sometimes, I think he would send me back. However, Henry Dundas played a very significant role in the 1790s in the slavery. He has got, of course, his legacies. You've got Dundas Street, you've got the statue in St. Andrew's Square, you've got Melville. There's a Melville place or terrace or somewhere in the meadows. And the fact is that his most important act is, I think, he was involved in various cases like the Joseph Knight case, and some historian says he supported the black person, Joseph Knight, to be free. The point is that I'm very suspicious about that case, because Dundas in that case actually said Knight was free in Scottish air. But if we take him back to Jamaica air produced slaves. And therefore, that was the philosophy or the theory or the politics. A black person was free in Scotland, but was a slave in the Caribbean. That was his view in the Joseph Knight case, 1774 to 1778. However, what I think he's notorious for, in 1792, William Wilberforce put forward a motion that the slave trade should be abolished. The Prime Minister was Pitt. Can't have any more power than that. Pitt, the Prime Minister, Dundas, Home Secretary, controlling war and the Navy. Dundas actually said the slave trade will be gradually abolished. One word. And that, a lot of historians have debated it, etc., etc. But I looked up Pitt's life, and I looked up Pitt's speech in 1792. And what Pitt, if anybody should know what Dundas meant by gradual, is Pitt. And what Pitt said it means, refusing to act until 1,000 favourable circumstances unite, while this enormous evil remains unredressed. That's what Pitt said. And therefore, Dundas's gradual was accepted, and it delayed the abolition of the slave trade for 15 years. Britain transported 42,000 42,000 slaves a year. So in 15 years, I think it comes to about 630,000. One word. Gradually. What we have, I talked about Joseph Knight, and I said he ran away in Perth and it went to court. He ran away because of a judgment in 1772. He ran away at about the same time from Wetherburn. And why did he run away? Because he heard that in England, a black person was released from his owner by this man, Lord Mansfield. Probably one of the most significant legal minds ever in British history. And he's Scottish, and he was the Chief Justice. He was the Lord Chief Justice, and he released Somerset. And that probably law still applies to us, in a sense that he said Somerset could not be removed from England without his consent. So nobody can take you out of this country without your consent, if it's not a legal manner. And that's what Mansfield ruled in 1772. What is interesting, we found that Mansfield was also the judge in the 1781 case of the Zong. And what was the Zong? A ship's captain, he was transporting slaves to Jamaica. He lost about 60 slaves, they died. And he figured if it went like that, he wouldn't have any slaves to sell, so he drowned them all, the remainders, about 121. He drowned them. And of course, the case went to court. Well, he wanted the insurance money. The ship's captain, he wanted the insurance money for those slaves he drowned. And Mansfield ruled in 1781 that he couldn't get that money. But you notice he wasn't tried for murder, because the slaves were not people, they were property. And those are his nieces. No, we never knew that he had one black niece and one white niece, Mansfield. And he was very fond of Dido, and she's mixed race. And he left money for her in his will and an order that she couldn't be removed from the country. So again, what I'm trying to say, you have a slavery, but you have relations. And those relations are very human. And that is what I think is important about people. Slavery shows that. It wasn't just about enslavement, it was about relationships. Sort of humanity. And again, that's the Joseph Knight case, I've mentioned it. But you'll be surprised that there are a lot of historians use that case in 1774 to 78 to say Scotland abolished slavery in 1778. And I thought, I've challenged that with historians, because what I think it is a sort of self-serving, it's an excuse to say, yeah, we were involved in the slavery, but look, we set Joseph Knight free. As one person against 800,000. And he wasn't a slave, he was a servant. And you can't abolish the slavery if you free a servant. And believe it or not, this is me saying this now, from 1778. Historians have tried to say Joseph Knight was a slave in Perth. A chattel slave, he had a wife. And he ran away in Jamaica as a chattel slave. You ran away, you'll be executed. If you stayed longer than a certain period, with no comeback at all. So again, what we have, and what I say to the historians, I say the Scottish people don't need that. They don't need an excuse. In terms of saying, we have a case which we're using to justify our behavior. I think that's totally unacceptable, and I don't think any decent person would want to accept that. And therefore, Dundas was involved in there, and what he did say, I've looked at the Caledonia Mercury, and it says the slave heir of Jamaica makes slaves. If you have the misfortune to find yourself in Jamaica as a black person, you will be a slave. And he says in Scotland, of course, that same person would be free, which I think is extremely, it's almost like an oxymoron in terms of statements like that. Again, when we looked at that document in the house, in Register House, it says, without any equivocation, slavery in the West Indies is supported by law. So this slavery, chattel slavery in the Caribbean, is not modern slavery, it is not Arab slavery, it is chattel slavery. It was illegal, and it had to be abolished. And again, Henry Dundas was involved. This is in 1796. Henry Dundas actually opposed, not just 1792, when he did gradual. In 1796, he opposed the motion that slavery should be abolished in 1796. And to prove this, I gave a lecture the other day, and a gentleman came up and gave me a code. He said, go to Register House with this code and you'll get Dundas's letters. So I took the code, went to Register House, and I got about 8 letters written by Henry Dundas. And this one was the most tatty, meaning people have looked at it the most. This letter, written in 18th of February 1796. And it says, as it says on the top, that's what the writing says. He's writing to one of these Lord pals, and just before he finishes the letter, he says, I have not time to write more. It is near 5, and I must go to oppose the proposals for the abolition of the slave trade. Yours sincerely, Henry Dundas. Sort of, it's near 5 o'clock, I've got to go. Now, that is the involvement of the man standing at St. Andrew Square. And who are people on the committee I'm on? In fact, Michael Fry said I should be removed from the committee. Will not put one sentence that Dundas calls the slave trade to be gradually abolished. All the other stuff is on it is complimentary. In fact, he was the last politician in Britain to be impeached, Henry Dundas, for manipulating naval funds. Can you imagine? And therefore, we have a situation where the Edinburgh Council and the people on that committee cannot arrive at a conclusion. I better hurry up. I think, make sure you... Okay. Okay, right. Again, because it's a story and it fits. And I don't do this very often. I usually reduce the number of slides, leave stuff out. But I think it's important because it is showing you the link of a slavery which was a business, and Dundas felt he was... In fact, the present Viscount, the 10th Viscount, actually says, like Fry, when Fry was asked about this, and it's on Twitter, so I'm not saying something out of turn, that when he was asked about this, Fry actually said, oh, what Dundas did, that was a tiny minor incident. And he said, well, our economy depended on this slavery, so he couldn't allow it to collapse. And it was in nobody's interest for it to be abolished. Now that's one of our historians who writes books that children are educated with. And therefore, we have a situation which somehow has gone into the consciousness of the way we act, the way we think. For example, I went to give a lecture during the festival, and when I arrived, the person that said, well, what can I do for you? And I said, I've come to give a lecture. And she said, what time? I said, 2 o'clock. And she looked at the names and she said, well, you can't be giving a lecture at 2 o'clock because Sir Geoffrey Palmer is giving a If you think that's bad. The other one was this about 2 months ago. I stopped at an institution in Edinburgh, and my phone had gone dead because it's an old phone. And I said to the guy at the door, "Can I have my phone charged because I've got to make an important phone call?" And he said, "Do you know anybody in this building?" I said, "Yeah, I used to know the boss." And he said, "Oh, you used to know the boss?" He said, "Were you his chauffeur?" The point is that it comes from this slavery. Yeah, it is. The irony is that some of us, a lot of people out there still, it's like the N-word. It relates to that slavery. That's where it comes from. And therefore, in fact, there is so much for us still to do. But the hopeful aspect of it, I was reading a document only yesterday, and Clarkson, one of the abolitionists, actually wrote that when in 1790s, during this period, there were lots of petitions that the trade should be abolished. And Clarkson says the greatest responses came from children, in contrast to adults. And John Gladstone, who was in awe of Pitt, and he wrote a chronicle of the life of Pitt, and you're talking about Pitt was involved with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and Gladstone wrote in his summary of the life of Pitt, 1792 April, gradual abolition of the slave trade by 68 votes. Gladstone regarded that as so important in the life of Pitt, that act of gradually abolishing the slave trade. Balcarras, quickly, Dundas made him governor of Jamaica in 1794 to 1801. Balcarras, whilst he was in Jamaica, his wife lived on George Street. The Laura Ashley building. That was her house. And of course, he not only had that house, that's the Balcarras house still today in Fife. And of course, he also had a very large house in Hague, in Wigan. However, Balcarras is a Lindsay. And that's the Laura Ashley building in George Street. Now, Balcarras also had a big house in Jamaica. Okay? And that big house called Marshall Penn Estate, and it's in Manchester, Jamaica. Now, my mother comes from Manchester. She was born in Manchester, in Jamaica. And in my little book here, can I just have a look at that? There is a receipt on page 86. So when I was doing this, I visited Jamaica, and I took some papers from my aunt's house because they were all very old, and they all died, like my mother. However, I took a receipt from the cabinet of where all my family lived, not long ago, probably about 2000, something like this. So anyway, I put the receipt in the book, and then when I was doing the research on Balcarras, as I say, I noticed that his house or his estate was called Marshall Penn. And I looked at my receipt last year, and I thought, and the receipt reads, this is the family piece of land where my family were born and live, still are today. The receipt says Marshall Penn. So I rang my cousin in Jamaica, and I said, because I lived in Kingston, I didn't live in the country. So I've been there, but only once. So I rang my cousin at Marshall Penn, and I said, can you see a big house with a red top near where you are? And she said, yeah, I can. I can see it's just over the road. My family, therefore, if we look at, let's get that one. That's the receipt, Marshall Penn. And that's my aunt's name at the top, Hilda Lamond. Okay? And that's Balcarres's, he was governor of Jamaica, but he also had slave plantations. And that's one of his slave plantations. So A was Marshall Penn, B was where the slaves lived, and C was another slave plantation called Martin Penn, and they were all owned by Balcarres. So my family, when slavery was abolished, must have just stayed on a piece of that land, because that's 970 acres. My family have got this acre of about 20. So the slaves who were in particular areas just stayed there, when Balcarres probably sold off the main house, which is now owned by somebody else. So again, I am descended from one of Balcarres's slaves. And I said to my cousin, send me a picture. So she photographed it, and when I blew it up, you see they only have 2 cows, and one's black and one's white. Of course, they were abolitionists. And one of the most significant abolitionists is this man, Henry Brougham. And Henry Brougham's house is in St. Andrew Square. And of course, they've just turned it into the Malmaison Hotel, which I think is a disgraceful. That somebody, and he actually petitioned that slavery should be abolished. And he was born in St. Andrew Square. Now, finally, what we have is at the Heriot Watt, just before I retired, I was sitting in the archive and I found 4 pages in a box. And I thought, the principal was speaking or somebody, and I'm reading this 4 pieces of paper. And it started off, "Dear Father, we've just had the vote for the abolition of slavery," in the letter. And it was written by Gibson Craig, who family owned where the Heriot Watt campus is, Riccarton. They owned it. And he was the MP for that area. And he was writing to his father in 1838. And nobody had seen that letter since 1838 and knew what it meant. So as soon as I read it, I knew it was the abolition votes. And in that letter he said, "I voted for abolition and I would do so again." And to me, that's the kind of attitude that we need to have, where we decide that something is wrong, we're not going to do it anymore, and we're going to do exactly as we did before. We're not going to be moved by whether politics or money. And to me, that's why I put that phrase up. And that's just Frederick Douglass, one of the American abolitionists who was here. But what Burns says, I feel, is very important, that should be repeated, where he said about Mrs. Oswald, she had hands that took and never gave. And that is how we live, where some people are so greedy and none good that they take and they don't give. And finally, there were rebellions in Jamaica, and that's Paul Bogle, who was hanged by Governor Eyre. I mentioned Eyre, the little street down there. He was hanged by Governor Eyre, and his name is Paul Bogle. And the Bogle is important because that's the plaque which Glasgow University, after they did their research, on the 23rd of August, they unveiled a plaque to 23rd of August 2019, they unveiled a plaque to the slaves who contributed the money they received. And when I arrived, I didn't know they were going to ask me to unveil it, but they did, and I unveiled the plaque. They even flew the Jamaica flag over the university on that day. And I unveiled the plaque, and that's what the plaque reads. That's Glasgow University's plaque, and I'll read it because it's so important. Near this site stood the house of Robert Bogle. Remember, the National Hero of Jamaica was hanged, is Bogle. So Robert Bogle is probably an ancestor of Paul Bogle. So Glasgow has published And this plaque is going up on the chapel forever. Near this site stood the house of Robert Bogle, 1821, a wealthy West India merchant and owner of enslaved people. During the 18th and 19th centuries, this university benefited from gifts made by individuals who had profited from slavery. This plaque commemorates the lives of all those who suffered enslavement. Now, to me, that, when I spoke then, I said, to me, this is the hope come true of thousands of people who died for no good reason other than people wanted to better themselves. And to me, that, in fact, is terribly important. It's more important than money. Glasgow is also going to give 30 scholarships to young people of Afro-Caribbean descent. And they've been to Jamaica, and they've linked up with the Chancellor, and they're going to do what they call reparative educational exchanges. Now, to me, that is important, and I hope that other institutions will follow. And I've just read today, somebody sent me that Bristol has just employed the first woman professor to look at their involvement with slavery. So that has set a trend which is terribly important. And that's the final statement in terms of the title of the lecture, where I feel the past, we can't change the past, but we can change the consequences of the past. And what that says is many of our prejudices are based on the cruelties of the past. We cannot change the past, but we can change the consequences. Thank you very much.